All right, we are in the community of Miku, and we're here with Ajani Lebourne. Ajani, we're on the bay in Miku.
Yes, thanks for having me, Bernard.
Yes, and Ajani Lebourne is, he's going to speak to us in a few capacities. He's a key member of the National Youth Council, so we'll obviously be discussing youth issues. But Ajani is a training development professional, and he's also a student of political science. So obviously we'll be discussing some politics and some science as well at some point in time. Ajani, like I said, we're on the bay. Obviously there's an issue here with sargassum. It's always been for years and probably will be for a few more years to come. I know there have been efforts to deal with it. So it's something, an environmental issue that we have to deal with for a pretty long time, especially along communities on the East Coast as well. But let's briefly talk about Miku itself, which is where you're from. And the youth movement here, how active is the youth movement in Miku?
Well, what we've found in Miku particularly is that the community is one where many young people who attend school find opportunities outside of the community. So you really find youth spend more time within the community to participate in voluntary and youth-related activities. So what we've found in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, the Youth and Sports Council was doing pretty well. In fact, the Miku Youth and Sports Council won 2 National Youth Awards for Outstanding District Youth and Sports Councils. In 2016, we revived that council, and at this point in time we're in a position where we've conducted a few community related activities. We're trying to strengthen the club structure, and we're hoping that in October we could be able to bring young people together to elect a new executive. So we're hoping that this is a start to great things, and we see a lot of potential in the movement. We're hoping also that we can tap into the skill sets and the interests of young people to be able to see that enthusiasm for youth development.
Mm-hmm. We are in Miku North, and we know of the history that happened here during the last political campaign, and we saw there was quite a bit of youth involvement and participation and we know too that this community is very rich in terms of culture and so on. In terms of, just one more question, in terms of the youth here, do you have a lot of women participation in the groups, or how is that, how would you assess that?
Women participation and girls participation is I think it's a lot more than the participation of males, and it's because, you know, the males have a lot more responsibilities if you look at, to be able to earn for their families, to be able to you know, sustain their own livelihoods. Particularly in this area, you see many of the young men participating in the fisheries and agriculture as well. So I think for us within this constituency, we want to sort of encourage more male participation. But the thing is, I mean, we've seen for young males, it may mean voluntary initiatives are not seen as attractive if not restructured and repackaged to give them an idea of how participating in youth groups and organizations can support their own livelihoods as well.
Because the reason why I asked, I've been here a few times and I haven't seen too many women on the waterfront, so I don't think there are too many young girls or young women who might be interested in fishing at the moment.
Right.
They may be, we don't know,
yes,
but I'm sure they might be. All right, very quickly to Ajani, you're also very involved with the National Youth Council, and we know that you had a couple of issues that you dealt with over the past few weeks and so on. I think that's behind you now in terms of moving forward. First of all, give us an update. Is there an election due? What is the latest with the NYC at the moment?
So we're aiming for an election towards the back end of this year. Unfortunately, but fortunately, the experience that we faced earlier this year allowed us to understand what were the key gaps within our organization. The organization has been working for, 36 years now. And the experience gave us an insight into the responsibility that we have as young leaders to create safe spaces for our young people. We did make a move to sort of renovate our office space to create that environment for young people who just need someone to talk to, who just need to tap into key services. And I think what we've learned is the need particularly for child safeguards to be put in place, the needs for, policies, systems, codes of conduct that allows for us to get the best out of the young people that we serve. Because ultimately, I think when you take a young person out of an at-risk environment and you bring them into an organization like a youth space, they're expecting, a certain degree of support and responsibility on the part of us as youth representatives. So we've recognized the need for that, and what we're doing moving into our General Assembly is to prioritize youth safety and security, the sustainability of the organization, and inclusivity, because we recognize it's important right now to restructure the NYC in that, and I guess we'll talk a lot more about that, in that we're seeing a gradual decrease in the participation of young people, of the basis that many young people are not necessarily members of clubs and organizations, and that's where the NYC structure or the power within the NYC lies. But we want to tap into the youth, the young people who would have gone out to school, who are returning, who would not necessarily spend time volunteering, the young people who are in communities unemployed, don't have much time to participate in voluntary activities because they're more geared towards sustaining their livelihoods. We want to structure the organization to facilitate the participation of these young people. So we're hoping in the next couple of months or so we can go through a process of reform and more or less presenting the organization in a new and refreshing manner that makes it a bit more attractive and presentable. We've been having that conversation for quite some time, but I mean the key thing right now as we transition is that we want to transition to a place that is better for the incoming team to move forward.
Now, I remember the last time that you had your General Assembly, it was almost like a campaign, a political campaign. It kind of mimicked a political campaign. It was good theater and so on. Is there any thought given to the approach? Because some people thought it was a little divisive and you didn't get the best quality people serving. Is there any thought being given to how you try and get an executive for the National Youth Council?
Personally, I've never been too fond of the team approach. I understand it's important to come into the NYC with an understanding of the young people that you're working with. So I think what we should prioritize is strengthening our structure so that as many young people who want to vie for office are more familiar with each other because they would have perhaps been members of the organization, they would have perhaps volunteered for the organization before, and they would have been aware generally of the youth space and more familiar with the structure. So what we're hoping to do, I don't think we're ready to move away from that because again, it's the choice of the young person and how they are how they're looking to vie for office. But we're hoping that the youth who vie for office can recognize that there's a bigger picture, that all youth issues are national issues, and notwithstanding the fact that you would have run for office with varying ideas of how the NYC should have been run, once that election is done, we have to go back to the drawing board and be able to work and build those relationships. And I think key to the organization is establishing relationships across the island. There's a need for us to recognize, notwithstanding the fact that you're a member of the NYC, there are young people who are outside of the structure who need to understand the structure. And in building relationships, we can sort of appeal to these young people and make the space one that is, again, inclusive and fully representative of the youth that we're supposed to serve.
Mm-hmm. Now I know one of the issues that's front and center is the national policy that eternally elusive apparently. What reasons were given to the NYC by the last administration for not implementing it? I know they were pretty close. They did claim it as a success, but I don't think it was actually implemented.
Yes. So the SLP administration in 2015 would have brought in a consultant funded by the Commonwealth Secretariat to revise the youth policy. Now, since 2003, we've been working on more or less an archaic policy, and then that process would have born a youth policy draft for the period 2018 to 2023. Now, in our tenure, our current tenure, we recognize that not much work was being placed in fast-tracking that process. And we've been talking about youth policy, but then you see priority being placed on other policies, being priority placed on other developments, and the fundamental policy framework to guide youth development is lacking. So when we pressured government to place attention on it, we got the idea that, or we were informed that the policy was reviewed, but then there were some issues that the cabinet of ministers had with that policy when it was presented. So what we were saying is that, well, if there are issues with the policy, how is the National Youth Council not aware of the gaps so that we can assist in getting the policy to where it needs to be? So we engaged in a few meetings and we were able to understand the need for the establishment of an action plan for the policy, because what we had was, just something on paper, but not any plan to say how these proposals and policies could be implemented or could sort of be weaved into our current structure. And there was also a missing link between the policy and monitoring and evaluation to say, For example, in the next 3 years, how is the policy going to work towards reducing youth unemployment, by how much, and through what key sectors, and what would be the drivers of that particular performance within our youth development space. So we had discussions along those lines. We were able to begin the work on developing the action plan, and at this point we're actually rolling out I would say a revised phase of that action plan. So there will be pretty soon more communications being put out in that regard. In that, I'm not sure if you saw that there was a survey being put out to get youth views on some of the current content of the policy, and we're hoping perhaps in the next month, 2 months or so, we can then begin to, because the plan is to return to the young people, present what is there, and use that information to tell us how the youth policy can be actionable within our current context. Because we recognize 2018 to 2023, there needs to be a review of some of the discussion that happened in 2015, so that 5 years down the line we can then look at something that is more reflective of our current environment.
Has there been any conversation or any approaches from this new government in terms of the national policy? Any discussions? Have you had any meetings with the new administration?
Our first meeting is tomorrow. That's with the Minister of Youth Development and Sports. So we're hoping to table issues in relation to youth clubs and organizations. How can we look to inject new energy into youth clubs? I shared something yesterday in relation to rethinking volunteerism. And I think that's a broader discussion that we need to have. Why are young people not participating in what we consider conventional voluntary activities? And I think it's to a great extent the fact that we as youth development practitioners haven't been paying attention or tracking the ways in which youth volunteer. Because young people volunteer their time on a daily basis, but are they volunteering their time within the activities that we consider conventional, and how can we use their interests to bring them into this space and to make their voluntary work one that benefits them and can provide them with some degree of support to sustain their livelihoods and to sort of make them marketable. So youth, a young person volunteers on a Sunday to put food together, to go down by the river to have a good time. A young person volunteers to prepare small goals for a football competition. They volunteer. It's just that I think we're not recognizing where the interests are. We're not recognizing the skill sets of the youth, and we're very slow in structuring our youth development landscape to tap into the interests of these young people. So I'm hoping we can pay attention to that a bit more. We could also look to incentivize youth development because youth, around about 30% youth unemployment, youth will prioritize means of survival. They will prioritize the ways in which they can earn for their families. And if we don't pay attention to the need to get young people into the structure by making youth development attractive, by incentivizing it, I think we'll miss out. So we're hoping to table that to the youth minister. We're hoping to also discuss the issue of youth safety and security and youth economic participation, particularly within this COVID-19 environment.
Because I think there's a broader discussion as you will be having as well, because we've heard so much about the youth economy. I'm not sure if it's been explained to the NYC what exactly it is. I know it's in the party's manifesto, and I suppose that might come up because I know the youth minister is probably not the one responsible for youth economy, so I don't know if that's a separate discussion or if he's representing government. But I guess we will find out after the meeting takes place. We're doing this interview on the 9th of September, and the meeting's on the 10th. Is that what it is? So that interview might come out after that meeting takes place, so certainly. So based on what you're saying, because there needs to be an NYC 2.0. As it currently stands, it's been there for 35 years, and if most people who look at a documentary can get a sense of and there's a documentary online YouTube that you can go to get a real sense of the history that led to the NYC's formation and the initial struggles, and up to this point where it's at now. It's at a very interesting crossroads. It's because it has outlived one generation, it's going to a second generation at the moment. So there's a need for a 2.0 NYC. Obviously, you will have a role to play in that as well, as somebody who is part of the organization, and like you say, with the General Assembly coming up. So talk to us about what are the key, and I did think you mentioned empowerment and so on, but some of the key things you want to see the NYC deliver to young people. That's a low-hanging fruit, not a big picture thing that's going to take 4 or 5 years to happen. But youth, let's say we're on the bay here in Miku, that youth in the area can start feeling the impact of the NYC.
Youth participation in that there is a presence of the NYC in our communities, that the youth can recognize the NYC speaking on relevant issues, that the NYC can be responsive to their needs, that the NYC has platforms available for youth to express how they feel about development, and that we're not reactive when tomorrow government puts out a policy or government takes a course of action that is not favoring young people, but we're a step ahead in saying what the youth of St. Lucia want, what the youth of St. Lucia recognize as key priorities. And we try to do that through our voter education campaign. We try to engage, underrepresented youth organizations. The LGBTQI community is one of the main organizations that I think generally are marginalized within our society. We have youth with disabilities. We have youth who are just generally disinterested, young Rastafarians who don't feel that there is a youth organization which is generally able to recognize the issues, recognize the challenges they face. And I think by doing that, we become an organization that is of youth, not just representing youth, but one that is able to present an image whereby when we call a general assembly or we call meetings, you have youth in droves from different walks of life who are just willing to hear what the NYC has to say. And I think that's what the NYC looked like back then. In that it was a new movement. People hear youth representation. Wow, we have an organization that can represent us and can bargain on our behalf. So if we can do that, I think it's very possible. The challenge we face is that there's so many other distractions. And as I mentioned, within our socioeconomic environment, youth will always prioritize their means of survival. So for an NYC to be relevant, an NYC 2.0 has to present a structure that can provide those basic needs of the young St. Lucian. And I think advocacy is a main part. And we also have to look at a model that can make the NYC financially viable, that can perhaps employ young St. Lucians, right? That can not just employ if there's not capacity to employ, but can look at bringing in grant funds to be able to support investments to get young people employed, partnerships to get youth employed. We had discussions with SLDB on a partnership that would have promoted financial literacy, and we recognize the need for that. So, I mean, there are certain discussions that need to continue to take place. There are internal challenges in terms of the funds that we receive from government. We certainly believe that there's a need for an increase in the subvention of the SLNYC. For the most part, we want to be able to empower not just the NYC from a macro standpoint, not from a national executive standpoint, but the importance of our District Youth and Sports Council, I think, are largely underappreciated. If you look at youth development, the voluntary initiatives, Labry got a grant fund from, I think it was the Austrian fund to be able to provide water tanks to families, to look at the importance of, consistent water supply for underprivileged families. And these are the areas that our youth groups are actually contributing in. So if we can do more of that work as an NYC, we could show a young person how we've been able to make life easier for your family. We've been able to give you access to this opportunity. We've been able to advocate on an issue that your representative was not paying attention to. I think it makes the organization one that is more relevant.
Is it functioning now more as an organization than an institution? Because it has to have a bigger role. And you did mention about the subvention. Obviously, for years we've been talking about the subvention is inadequate, and that governments basically pay lip service to youth. They might put you on a committee, but don't give you the resources, whether financial or human, to be able to develop your members and to get your projects and so on going. And you mentioned either the government of Austria or Australia is assisting, and these are the roles that we expect our government to be playing as well in terms of helping youth to deliver to their community. Talk to us about that part of it in terms of the role of youth in developing communities, but also the need to have a deeper injection from national government into the NYC. And to the NYC become, I know you have a secretariat with some staff who are there, but the president is just volunteering. Basically, that's what it is. Your executive, executive.
Yeah.
Is there a thought being given to repositioning the NYC to become more of some kind of an institution or department for youth? as opposed to just an organization that exists in temporary quarters.
Right, and we've been talking about that for quite some time. Most importantly, within the discussion on the youth policy and the youth development landscape, because what we see is youth development being carried out in silos. So you have SLDB and the Ministry of Commerce doing one thing with young entrepreneurs. You have Ministry of Agriculture doing their own youth agricultural program. You have Ministry of Education working with students' councils, working with students to provide opportunities along those lines. But I believe there needs to be a coordinated effort. My vision is more or less a youth coordinating agency whereby we bring all our resources to the table and we determine what part each entity can play towards contributing to youth development. And if we're competing along those lines, there's information, there's knowledge that we're not sharing and we're not actually benefiting from. So the NYC can also benefit from that, in that we are the agency considered as the main point for youth participation and involvement. We have the structure at the community level. This is where you get youth to come into the structure to know what's available. The resources, however, are not with us, but with government and other agencies. So I believe the NYC can be funded through some of those initiatives and projects. And that's why we've been talking about the youth policy, because there's so many recommendations in there for, a skills-based curriculum, recognizing the need to make youth development one that can be professionalized. And with the NYC, we can see how our secretariat can be funded to roll out these programs, right? With technical support from the ministries. Our youth groups within the communities can be the main point for rolling out and establishing some of the interventions that the government wants to roll out. The youth economy provides a great opportunity for that. With discussions with the current parliamentary rep here, we understood that, and one of the things that we brought forward was the need for the Youth and Sports Council to be able to provide a database of young entrepreneurs, of youth and their skill sets, so that we can present that to the government and say, hey, here's the young people who need the assistance, and through that we can see at least some movement being made. So, we understand that the NYC has a role to play in autonomous youth representation, and sometimes it may be risky for governments to invest in an organization that they have no direct control over. But ultimately you need autonomous representation to be a check and balance for your work. And I think with the view that many of our politicians have of civil society and decentralizing power, it's sort of working against us, because you're not empowering the people to be able to be the future leaders and to be able to take the country to a different level. I definitely believe that if we can rethink how we look at development by integrating NYC, other key civil society organizations into the conversation on a consistent basis, we will begin to see the movements that we need.
I was a little disappointed that there wasn't, when we were looking for independent senators, I was hoping that a representative from the Youth Council would be on there. And I know there are the two gentlemen who are appointed independent senators, the youthful, and they may represent the youth perspective, but I was really hoping that at least, I don't know if it's in the policy, but one of the seats of an independent senator should go to the youth movement, because you want them at that level articulating and being part of where you make your laws and so on, where you pass key government decisions and so on. But it didn't happen. But is that something that would be desirable for the NYC to at least have at least one senator? I know there may be ministers in government who are representing youth, but the NYC itself needs to have that high-profile presence as well.
Definitely, because one of the main things I think many people who are outside of the NYC structure are unable to recognize is that we're swimming against the tide in so many different ways. The policies that marginalize young people hurt us, because youth become, they distrust and they become apathetic to the system. Public institutions are not their main point of interest. So our work is twice as hard when you see policies that give youth the impression that the system is working against them. So having that representation will certainly allow us to have at least one foot in the door to be able to share those things on a national platform, and to also have a direct impact on shaping policy. We also want to strengthen our youth parliament structure, because I mean, we're not just asking for a seat, but we want to create our seat. And there are some challenges with the youth parliament structure because, I mean, there needs to also be a concerted effort between ourselves and the Ministry of Youth Development and Sports to institutionalize youth parliament. But also for the cabinet and for any government in power to recognize the role that a youth parliament plays, not just to be you know, I would say just
An exercise.
a one-off exercise, but more or less an institution that can actively, you know, advocate on issues and also be able to be, again, a check and balance on the policies that are being implemented frequently.
Yeah, a previous interviewee has suggested that the youth parliament become more of a regular thing. Either it comes before and after the actual parliament. Once a month might be a little frequent, but we have enough youth to participate in parliament, sure. And the other thing too is probably there could be a youth parliament that could pass a resolution and submit it to the other parliament that can now consider as part of the business that this is what the youth wants us to consider. And so there might be a conversation that the NYC will need to have with the Speaker of the House and government in terms of creating a youth parliament and giving it some significance and some authority to pass resolutions that the upper and lower house can now consider.
Yeah, I know it won't be difficult because I can give you an example of, you know, for the youth parliament that we've been wanting to host in previous years. Key individuals wanting to review our motion before it is even debated. So if you have that sort of pushback, it gives you an impression of how much of a challenge that we face as young people to fight, I mean, the ageist structures that make it difficult for us to create and to have a seat. So, I mean, that's where we need to work on empowering ourselves. We need to work on ensuring that when we come to the table, we have something substantial to put forward, because it's not just about having a seat, but it's also about having the systems and the structures in place where whatever you put forward at Parliament is reflective of what the young people actually feel. So we have a lot of work to do, and again, that's why we're talking about inclusion. We're talking about restructuring so that when we can have the opportunity to be represented in Parliament, we know for sure that what we're saying is a direct reflection of the realities of young people, and not just, I mean, an executive speaking on behalf of youth.
Yeah, agreed that. I think that's one of the ways of getting youth involved in the decision making. And it actually can be the actual bills that the government is actually debating. That you can actually, like they just recently amended one of the laws to allow you to carry at least 30 grams of marijuana. So, and I'd like to hear a youth debate on that as well, to know what the youth actually think. So it will impact them. In any case, all the laws that are being passed today will impact you and the National Youth Council members in 20, 30 years from now. You have to deal with it. You might have to amend it yourself if you get to government as well.
Yes.
As we hear on the Bay, there are a lot of other issues that the youth have to consider, because you will be dealing with that 20, 30 years from now. One is environmental, cultural as well, the decline in our culture, our folk music and so on. I was listening to a CD this morning, and some of the folk forms, the music forms that I heard on the CD, now it's not evident currently, and it's not even being, there's no groups, playing some of that music and so on. Let's start with the environment first of all. Talk to us about that aspect of it. How invested is the National Youth Council in environmental discussions and so on?
There's a lot more work that we need to do to be able to bring in the perspective of youth and the environment into our work. So we have a very good relationship with the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, where, for initiatives that are being proposed, initiatives that government is looking to roll out, we've had discussions on, like the ESCAZO agreement. We've had discussions currently. We're actually working with the Ministry of Agriculture to host a discussion for World Food Day on, food security and sustainability along those lines. So, we have these one-off engagements every now and then where we propose representatives, but there is not much of and again, it goes back to creating the platforms. It's that we really need to work on establishing, I would say independent frameworks or independent spaces whereby, if we are to present a policy or position paper on youth and the environment, we have a structure that is established of young, young educated youth who have gone out to study along the lines of climate change and the environment and sustainability, we can consult. We can, be able to have roundtable discussions and educated, dialogue on youth and the environment. We need to do a lot more to be able to present that image and to also be able to get youth as part of the movement towards creating a sustainable environment. International Youth Day, which just went by, focused on food systems, sustainable food and environment systems. And in St. Lucia, there are young people who are actually leading the charge in creating that sustainable movement. Kiflin Carew from Helen's Daughters, Joanne and Dujour. You have Optronics, young people within the space of tech who are creating some of those innovations to be able to move along the lines of sustainability. So I think if what we can do for sure is to advocate for these young people to have a permanent seat on boards in positions whereby they can then lead the charge. From a national standpoint, we need to make these young people the face of a resilience in Lucia. Because if we're talking resilience, we're talking 10, 15 years down the line. So with the innovations that they've been able to put forward, we then need to champion them. We need to fund their investments. We need to be able to present them as the future of what we want St. Lucia to be like. And I think if we can do that, the NYC then in itself has to also work to strengthen its own structures to reflect what these young people are doing. So I think what we should also look to do is to work with many of these youth who have these investments, who have these innovations, to work within our structure to give them the opportunities to present them within the communities. So I definitely acknowledge that there's a lot more work that we need to do in that regard.
And obviously in the area of culture as well, because we have fewer hours groups than we had before. We have a reduced youth involvement as well, not just youth, but general involvement. So these are some of the areas, because in 10, 20 years time we may have no more hours groups, because I think we probably have a handful now. And what we're hoping that this is not the case, and we know there's some youth who are invested in culture who will see to it that there's a sustenance of folk groups. And as I was talking about the environment, one of the things that is possible, for example, every football team, because that's the only sport that has probably a team in every community in St. Lucia, should take some responsibility for the environment as well. At least your playing field, maintain that area, make sure there are no plastic, plant trees, little things that there are some low-hanging fruits as well for the youth. When I was listening to the documentary, there was talk of whether the NYC should get involved in politics, whether it should be a political organization, and one person said, yes, youth can get involved in politics, and there was another view that said, well, no, they shouldn't. Is that an issue that preoccupies the NYC?
It is a balancing act in that we have our own independent ideologies as members of the organization. And sometimes when you have your independent ideology and you're in a position of influence, you want to find ways to be able to bring that forward. It is a need, there's a strong need for the NYC to certainly have a greater role, a greater voice in the politics of our country. Our organization is dynamic. I say we're the only national organization which has a structure that has to appeal to a community grassroots structure and also a national structure. So there's a lot that we also need to balance. Our members have their own ideologies as well. So when we talk about building consensus, there's a challenge in the NYC speaking to represent its organization at a national level on the basis of where the members think, but also being responsive to the current movements and where the leadership thinks the opportunity lies. So we're not, I would say, we're not affected by the, let me not say we're not affected. We certainly recognize that the organization must have a strong voice. We're affected by the need to always remain in a position that allows our members to understand that we prioritize their viewpoints as opposed to ours as leaders. But what we need to continue to do is to be able to always be in a position whereby we can have those discussions with our members on current developments, and that I think when we talk about youth in politics, we talk about youth involvement just within political spaces, but not necessarily youth and their involvement in their own spaces and how that can contribute towards political leadership.
Yeah, because in the documentary, there was, like I said, the debate about whether the NYC should be. Now, it's true that it appears that the NYC sometimes could be pro-SLP because there are a lot of people who have gone into the SLP stream that have come out of the NYC. And I heard a couple of voices saying, yeah, it ought to be political, but then when the shoe is on the other foot, then they say, oh, why are you getting involved in politics? So I guess, like you say, there's that delicate balancing act that you need to work through as a youth movement.
Yeah, and that's why the youth parliament structure doesn't always rely on a national executive to present the viewpoints of youth, because they recognize youth in themselves have the right to have have varying viewpoints. So our youth parliament can allow for youth to be able to represent the interests of their constituencies in an independent way. We certainly will continue to have a voice in the landscape. I don't think back then there was too much of a challenge or an issue with where the NYC fell, as opposed to now. Right now, I think our organization...
Well, the minister at the time when you were starting had an issue with that because he denounced it when it was formed.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but I guess we've passed that point.
Yeah, and the thing is, the environment that the NYC would have been birthed out of is different from the environment now. Youth, I think, right now are a bit more concerned about how both parties have treated youth development. Because, I tend to say, if you look at 2021 and the state of youth development in St. Lucia, it is a product of how both parties would have, treated and would have recognized youth involvement generally. So young people are less interested in which party is doing right, but more interested in what we can for ourselves, what can we do for ourselves in encouraging parties to recognize what we need. And that's why we're not too, perturbed by discussions on where the NYC falls, whether it's Labour, Flurbo. It's not a big factor for us. What we're mostly prioritizing is getting youth to express their voices, getting youth to have a seat at the table, and empowering and training our young people to be able to have independent thoughts. And to me, as a youth leader, that's the most important thing, independent thought. We don't want youth to fall in line because as an executive we say that this is where we should be focusing, but we also want our members to hold us accountable to say, guys, can we look to take this into consideration instead? And we're hoping that within that sort of move, we can get young people to be custodians of the environment, to be more, I would say, to take control of their spaces, to demand the changes that they need to be made. In Miku, for an example, we have a Youth and Sports Council here. And to me, the role of our branches is not just to roll out voluntary initiatives and not just to partner within the constituency level, but to be a voice generally to keep representatives in check and balance. So for the most part, there needs to be a considered effort, and that's why our students' councils, I think, are sort of the real point of which we can create a sustainable NYC, in that we invest in student leadership, and then you have young people who are coming through the movement, having independent thought, being educated, and being empowered to be able to express themselves at any given opportunity.
I always ask my guests that question about youth and scholarships. The country gives one island scholar, sometimes two, I think. Is that something that the NYC thinks about? Because we have other countries giving us way more scholarships. And to me, if you're serious about investing in your youth, at least the youth who are struggling to get scholarships to go and study and so on. What is the NYC? Is this something that the NYC has discussed? And is there room for government to offer a lot more scholarships to young people?
Yes, it's something that we plan to table with this new incoming administration. We did have a conversation with the last administration, but the steps towards that was not as favorable as we would have expected. So we're hoping that, one, we can look to provide more national scholarships to youth in, I know that government, the ministry has sort of priority areas. So we need to see a lot more provided along those priority areas. I think we need to stress on research. We need to sort of encourage more young people to go out to study, to return as young researchers, to be able to drive a lot of the work that our ministries are doing, to give it a bit more of a progressive outlook, and a more forward-thinking outlook, as opposed to this is how we've been doing it all the time, this is how we must continue to do it. And it goes back to also, because on a yearly basis there are so many young people who go out to study, who come back with, I mean, illustrious degrees, who have so much knowledge, but there's not much of the space and the platform for them to present that. So and the youth economy does present a great opportunity for that, not just to provide grant funding to youth entrepreneurs, but also feed ideas to the ministry and to government to be able to table initiatives that are unconventional, but may just be, I mean, the next step to getting to tapping into emerging industries. So we want to see more young people going out to study. We want to see more young people getting the opportunities to tap into, you know, the experiences, the cultural experiences out there.
All right. Ajani, is there any final comments? I mean, even if you can tell us even about your own prospects and so on, without giving us too much of your plans, but what are some of the things that you are involved with and you plan to continue working in for the next couple of years?
Well, firstly, you know, as a final thought, I want to say that there's work that we need to do in St. Lucia from the educational standpoint, to encourage an identity-based curriculum, to encourage a curriculum that reflects the St. Lucia that we want to see. That, I mean, our system is largely meritocratic in that, you know, everything, there's this fixed criteria whereby the student goes through the system and they're expected to participate and to perform at a certain level. And within the job sector, you also have that criteria whereby someone is promoted off of, you know, a certain criteria. My thing is that I understand the role a meritocracy plays in advancing our society, but I also think we must also look at establishing these checks and balances to the system, where the youth and the individuals who do not necessarily fit within that mold can be provided alternate pathways. And I think that should be our focus, alternate pathways. The youth who may not necessarily go through school as considered high achievers can be placed into a sector whereby their skills can be recognized. Again, it goes back to the skill-based curriculum. How can we provide certification to our youth, not necessarily the academic certifications, but skills-based that can make them marketable within the job sector. I think also the discussion also is within our education system on, the discussion needs to continue on whether we want to move forward with our school ranking system, whether that creates an unfair competition or it gives certain schools a competitive advantage over others, whether that works to the benefit of our system. I don't think it does. I think our focus should be on streamlining education, on maintaining a standard across the board, on removing the stigmas that are attached to certain schools, in encouraging a young person in Miku to attend school in Miku, because, you know, on a daily basis, your conversations, your interaction within the community help to build that network and an environment that makes the community better to reside in, as opposed to going to another school and thinking, well, this place is more attractive for me. I think this should be our focus within the system. To, yes, the meritocracy works in that, yes, we can progress our country along certain lines where we're able to see where best we can compete, but we also need to pay attention to the youth who our system has generally disenfranchised and marginalized, and find ways to be able to get them to participate and to be their best selves and to be themselves and not try to be someone else. That should be our priority. And for me, I certainly see opportunity within this country, this constituency, to continue to work for the young people of the constituency, because on a daily basis, I walk through the constituency and I see so much potential. I mean, just along this bay, there's so much potential for this place to be, I mean, generally an attraction for young people. I mean, within this COVID-19 environment, so many youth are, I mean, limited to their home space. And if we can beautify these spaces, if we can make these spaces points of attraction and safe spaces for youth, then ultimately you make your constituency a community that people want to be in. I certainly see the need to continue to strengthen the youth structure in Micoud, because as opposed to the lack of employment opportunities within the community, I think youth can also benefit from strengthening the community networks, from knowing who is who, knowing the resources that are available in the community, and also just building the spirit of community, looking out for each other. And I think for this community, which is Micoud and again Monrepo, Micoud North, there needs to also be a focus on encouraging the advancement of the agricultural sector and other key industries like the fishing sector, to be able to strengthen the livelihoods of our people. And I don't think we're focusing squarely on establishing that local market whereby we have that ongoing trade of goods and services within the constituency, because what we have is that rural communities are always the drivers of the urban communities, always the ones providing for urban communities. But then if we can provide the opportunities here for young entrepreneurs to establish enterprises that they can purchase from the young farmers, they can purchase from the fishermen here to be able to drive that industry, I think we help us to be able to depend on ourselves. We help our people to depend on the resources available where at their disposal. And that's why I see this constituency as having so much potential. And I will continue to do as much as I can to make youth within Micoud feel proud to call themselves Micoudians. I continue to see the opportunity for young sportsmen to not want to play football outside of Micoud, but for them to see the Micoud Football League as the most encouraging and most competitive league. For young entrepreneurs, for young educated Micoudians to return to the community and see how they can contribute towards building the community through their skill sets. And from the political standpoint, that politicians and representatives constantly see the need to consult the young people within the constituency, constantly see the need to create the platforms for young people in Micoud to express what Micoud they would like to see. And that's why I will continue to work within the constituency to strengthen the networks and to empower our young people.
Ajani, we really appreciate you having us here, especially on the bay, a lovely bay in Micoud. And we look forward to having future conversations with you as well. All the best.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and thanks to Calabash TV for this wonderful interview.